It's 1967, and for the last 2.5 decades, the NHL has enjoyed one of the most consistent and stable eras in the history of professional sports. In 25 years, there hasn't been expansion, contraction, or even so much as a relocation of any one of the league's 6 teams. Really, outside of the Bruins trading in brown for black to go along with the yellow, nothing much has changed at all. Meanwhile, even outside of a Second World War having taken place and everything else going on in the world, just in the world of sports alone, a lot has changed around the NHL. Both the MLB and NFL have expanded well past the NHL, and while it's still far from as popular at this point in time, even the relatively young NBA is in more cities. So with all that and TV starting to change sports forever, for the NHL, it was time to adapt or die. Welcome back to NHL 101 and part 4 of our History of Hockey series, for now mostly focused on the NHL. Obviously, there have already been 3 parts in this series so far, so if you missed any of those, there are links for them down in the description below, and if you want to see any of the future parts, well, there's a button down there for that as well. New York Rangers Governor William Jennings, yes, the one from the trophy, proposed the idea of a 2-team expansion. The idea isn't a new one for a league that again has watched the same 6 teams play since 1942, but all along they've been denying bids for expansion so as to not have to split revenue between more owners. So basically your classic short-term greed standing in the way of long-term growth type of situation. Good thing that's completely gone away. Though not wanting to split revenue as a reason to not expand was far from the end of the greed, and by far not the dumbest thing that the league had decided to do over these last few years. The NHL had surprisingly been a leader of sports broadcasting on TV, but maybe less surprisingly, when those early TV contracts expired in 1960, the league opted to go without TV for a few years. Why? Not because the owners didn't see the value of TV and how it was helping their league, not to mention the other leagues in North America, grow, but because they also saw how TV broadcasting was helping boost the image of the players of those leagues, which the NHL owners feared would help give those players more leverage when it came time to negotiate new contracts. Not to mention the fact that with television growing more and more every year, the NHL didn't want to have to deal with potentially changing game times for the sake of TV networks and their schedules. Finally, after years of negotiating in 1965, the league would be told that if they wanted new TV deals, they would need to expand. After all, by this point, the king of sports, the MLB of course, had 20 teams, the ever-growing NFL was up to 14 after having merged with the AFL, I mean, even the fledgling NBA already had 9 teams. And while sure, the 6 teams the NHL did have were plenty popular and had plenty of history behind them, when you have just one team in 6 different markets, especially when those 6 markets are as close together as the NHL's were, it is somewhat limiting when it comes to national popularity and national TV broadcasting. So, not expanding means no new TV deals. Okay, not a problem, the NHL doesn't want either of those things anyway. Or at least, it wouldn't have been a problem if it didn't also come with the threat that those TV companies might start televising WHL games, a growing hockey league out west that's starting to compete with the NHL. In the end, with a real threat of another hockey league potentially getting a TV deal and then competing with the NHL, plus knowing that it would help grow the league as well as give them some immediate financial returns, they begrudgingly agreed to expand. And expand they did, not just dipping a toe in like with the 2-team proposal that Jennings made 2 years prior, but deciding to double the size of the league right away, adding 6 teams for the 1967-68 season. 14 different applications were submitted, including early favorites from Vancouver and the Bay Area, as well as multiple applications from LA and Pittsburgh. And eventually, the 6 new expansion teams to join the league were chosen: the California Seals, the LA Kings, the St. Louis Blues, Minnesota North Stars, Philadelphia Flyers, and Pittsburgh Penguins, with Baltimore being a backup in the event that one of those teams wasn't ready in time. But they all were. Not wanting to mix things up too much though, the NHL would put those 6 new teams in their own division, with some concerns over the level of competition between the new teams and the original 6, especially due to some pretty restrictive expansion draft rules and already very limited player movement at this point in time. What this also meant though was that after the 74-game regular season, with the league adding 4 more games on top of the previous 70, was that 4 of those 6 expansion teams would make the newly expanded 8-team playoff. And not only that, but one of the 4 was guaranteed a spot in the Stanley Cup final. Unfortunately, the first year of this new 12-team NHL would be one marred by tragedy when, on January 13th of 1968, 29-year-old North Stars rookie Bill Masterson took a hit in open ice against the California Seals, and his head came down on the ice hard. And with this being still before anyone wore helmets, although he was rushed to the hospital, he would end up dying from the injury 2 days later. Sadly, becoming the first, but thankfully still only NHL player to ever die due to an injury suffered in a game. In his honor, the league would create the Bill Masterson Memorial Trophy, still to this day awarded every year to the player who best exemplifies perseverance, sportsmanship, and dedication to hockey. And while again, up until the time of Masterton's death, few, if any, players wore a helmet in the NHL, and those that tried were heavily criticized and urged not to, cause, I don't know, I guess tradition and not being afraid of a little head injury is more important than personal safety and your future. After all, the only thing someone should be afraid of is change. I mean, granted, helmets back then were basically glorified plastic bowls, but it's still probably better than nothing. After his death, that anti-helmet sentiment across the league would start to ease up a bit and players would slowly start wearing helmets over the next few years. But it would take another decade before the NHL would step in and start requiring new players to wear a helmet. By the end of that first season, it was clear that there had been a reason for the concern over the level of competition between the expansion teams, none of whom ended up finishing with a winning record, and the original 6, only the Red Wings of which failed to do so. Still though, as per the rules, 4 of those 6 expansion teams did make the playoffs, and eventually the St. Louis Blues in their inaugural season made it to the Stanley Cup Finals, where they would take on the Montreal Canadiens, who would end up sweeping them in 4 games. The following year, 2 more games would be added to the schedule for a total of a 76-game season, in which Bruins defenseman Bobby Orr would score 21 goals, setting a new NHL record for a defenseman, as he started a still to this day record run of 8 consecutive Norris trophies. Meanwhile, his teammate in Boston, Phil Esposito, became the first NHL player to put up more than 100 points in a single season. And in case you're worried about those 2 games making the difference, he went well past 100, totaling 126 that year. Though, in spite of the 2 of them setting all those records in Boston, it was once again Montreal and St. Louis who met in the finals. And once again, it was the Habs who came with the brooms ready. The next year, Orr would take his game to the next level, responding to what his teammate Esposito had done the year previous, this time becoming the first defenseman in NHL history to put up over 100 points in a single season, and in the process winning the Art Ross, the trophy given to the player who scores the most points across the league. It's a feat that he would continue, scoring over 100 points, for the next 5 seasons, including another Art Ross in that process. And still, to this day, those 6 100-plus point seasons, 2 Art Ross trophies, as well as the 139 points and 102 assists that he put up in the 70-71 season, are all NHL records, with really the only player who's ever challenged any of it being Paul Coffey. And as far as that season that started it all in 69-70, this time it would be enough to get the Bruins to the finals, where once again it was the St. Louis Blues representing the expansion teams that was there to meet them. And for the 3rd time in a row, the Blues fell in 4 games, this time to the Bruins, who win their first Stanley Cup since 1941. And not only that, but even with this being a 4-game sweep of the Blues that wins the Bruins the Cup, Orr still manages to score one of the most iconic goals in the history of the NHL to win Game 4 in overtime, clinching the series and the Cup win for Boston. Now, taking a step back and rewinding a couple of years, you may have noticed something about those 6 teams that were chosen for expansion. The most obvious is that in spite of this being a Canadian sport played certainly at the time predominantly by Canadian players, none of the 6 teams are in a Canadian city, especially when you remember that Vancouver seemed like a lock to get a team through the application process. This made, I think pretty understandably, most Canadians, including the Prime Minister at the time, quite displeased with the league, to say the very least. Now, there were a few Canadian citizens who were not only happy about the fact that none of those expansion teams were Canadian, but even worked hard to make sure that was the case. And those, of course, would be the owners of the Toronto Maple Leafs and Montreal Canadiens, who didn't want to share CBC coverage of their teams on TV in Canada. You may also have noticed that St. Louis, who we just saw went to 3 consecutive Stanley Cup Finals to start off their franchise, was not even a city that submitted an application, with St. Louis in the end being awarded an expansion team by the NHL in order for them to get the approval vote from Blackhawks owner Arthur Wirtz, who owned a rundown arena in St. Louis that he wanted to make money off of, that the NHL needed in order to make the expansion happen in the first place. So, as much as Blues fans might hate the Blackhawks, who are still owned by the Wirtz family, by the way, doing a still fantastic job of running that franchise, especially over these last few years, they do have the Blackhawks to thank for having the Blues in the first place. Meanwhile, also in that whole expansion process, Buffalo was actually going to be awarded a team, until Steelers owner Art Rooney stepped in to convince the NHL to include Pittsburgh, who eventually got the Penguins. Even with all of that, however, and even after the NHL had put off their first expansion for 25 years, the second expansion came quite quickly when those two wrongs were righted prior to the 1970-71 season, with both Buffalo and Vancouver being awarded expansion teams, Vancouver getting the Canucks and Buffalo getting the Sabres. The addition of which did require a slight reorganization of divisions. For obvious reasons, they put Buffalo in the East with the original 6 teams, and then instead of putting Vancouver in the West with the previous 6 expansion teams, the NHL instead decided to move Chicago to the West Division, and in an effort to keep the 2 new expansion teams together, put their now westernmost team in Vancouver in the Eastern Division. Because somehow that made more sense than just splitting the 2 teams up, or even having the Sabres play in the West, which still had teams like Chicago and both the Pennsylvania teams. As a result, probably not terribly surprisingly considering most of the talent was still on the original 6 teams, in the now 78-game regular season, Chicago was very clearly the best in the West, and they rode it all the way to the Stanley Cup Final where they met the Montreal Canadiens, who would end up beating them in 7 games, and then would do the same thing again 2 years later. And in between those 2 meetings of the Hawks and Habs in the finals, with a new playoff format in 1972 that made it possible for multiple teams from the East to meet in the Stanley Cup Finals, the Bruins, still with Orr and Esposito dominating the league year after year statistically, would win their 2nd cup in a few years, this time against the New York Rangers. With all that having been said though, a new era in the NHL was on the horizon, and it was one that would no longer be solely dominated by the original 6. Violent, hard-hitting play and fighting had always been a part of hockey, and to some extent still are, but the sport had seen nothing like what the mid-70s brought. By this point, most teams had at least one enforcer-type player that would come to the defense of a teammate if he was getting roughed up, especially if that teammate was a star player. But then came the Broad Street Bullies. After having been almost defenselessly beaten into the ground in back-to-back years by the Blues in the playoffs, then Flyers owner Ed Snyder had had enough and saw to it that that would never happen to his team again. Setting to toughening up the roster over the next few seasons, and by 1973, he had a near entire roster of enforcers, or at least guys that were willing to throw gloves. Led by the appropriately nicknamed Dave the Hammer Schultz, as well as Hall of Famers Bob Clark, Bill Barber, and in goal Bernie Parent, the Flyers would bully the rest of the league over the next few seasons, eventually bashing, beating, intimidating, and scoring their way to back-to-back Stanley Cup wins in 1974 and 75. In the process, becoming not just the first expansion team to win a cup, but the first one to defeat an original 6 team in a playoff series at all, beating both the Rangers and then Bruins in 74 to win that cup, and then the following year defeating fellow expansion team the Buffalo Sabres, with of course that 75 Cup final between the Sabres and Flyers being the first one ever between non-original 6 teams. They would return to the Cup for a 3rd consecutive time in 76, but this time were swept aside by the Canadiens in 4 games, much to the joy and relief of every hockey fan or even person involved in hockey outside of Philadelphia, the vast majority of whom had grown to despise the Flyers and their new brand of hockey. Although, outside of those in Montreal, they may have been less excited about the fact that this did start a run of 4 straight Stanley Cup wins for the Habs. While the loss to the Habs may have ended this run for the Flyers, at least as far as winning cups is concerned, it was only the beginning of the enforcer era in the NHL. An era where every team had at least one guy that was basically a professional bar fighter on skates. Guys who, especially as the years went on, oftentimes were nowhere even near NHL level players, but what they could do was serve as a very effective deterrent for other teams going after their team's star players. While the expansion Flyers made their mark on the NHL and its players, there was a bigger threat looming to the NHL, and especially its more traditionalist fans, and that was the WHA. Founded in 1971 by a couple of Americans, Dennis Murphy and Gary Davidson, the former founder and first president of the ABA respectively, a basketball league that would eventually merge into the NBA, the WHA would also not take long to become a problem for the NHL. While the expanding the NHL had done, including adding a few teams out west, had helped their problems a little bit and even eventually helped kill off the WHL, their previous thorn in the side, with there still only being 3 teams west of Minnesota in the NHL, there was still plenty of space in the western half of the continent for the WHA to step into and fill some of that hockey interest. That said, it wasn't just market competition that made the WHA a real threat to the NHL, as just a year into the league's existence, it started stealing players from the NHL in 1972. And not just nobodies, it included original 6 Chicago Blackhawks star Bobby Hull, one of the best hockey players of his generation. Even if, let's just say, he hasn't necessarily turned out to be a Hall of Fame human being. And in response, the NHL frantically went about expanding again to try to solve the problem, adding 4 more teams by 1974, eventually tripling the league's size from what it was just 7 years prior. Not fully grasping the assignment though, all 4 of those teams were in the eastern half of the US, with the New York Islanders and Atlanta Flames joining in 1972, and then the DC Capitals and Kansas City Scouts in 74. As a result, it may not come as a terribly big surprise that the rapid expansion of the NHL didn't solve the league's problems, and in fact, the continuing war with the WHA was slowly killing both leagues. One of the newest expansion teams, the Capitals, thanks in large part to still pretty restrictive expansion draft rules, as well as a very diluted talent pool with both the WHA stealing players and the rapid expansion of the NHL, only managed to win 8 of the now 80 games in their inaugural season. A season for them that is still not only the worst ever inaugural season for an expansion team, but just the worst single season in the history of the NHL, period. And so a couple of years later, already with struggling expansion teams and a league out west that was still competing for not just attention, but the league's players, in 1976, when the Blues were nearing bankruptcy and far from the only team with financial problems, the NHL had no choice but to agree to allow teams to relocate for the first time in decades. And in an effort to salvage as much as possible, that's just what they did. The Kansas City Scouts moving to Colorado after just 2 years in the league and becoming the Rockies. No, not the baseball team. There was a Colorado Rockies hockey team before the baseball team showed up. Though that certainly would have been something to see, a hockey team playing baseball. And it actually would explain some of the Rockies' issues over the years. As well as the Seals, who by now had rebranded multiple times, originally the California Seals, then the Oakland Seals, and by now they were the Bay Area Seals, end up moving to Cleveland, becoming the Barons. But that move for the Seals, now Barons, proved to not quite be enough to save the franchise, as after just 2 years in Cleveland, and a few different failed attempts to merge with other teams, including DC, Vancouver, and even the WHA's Arrows, eventually they were allowed to merge with the also struggling North Stars in order to save at least one of the 2 franchises. And also, in effect, for the first time since the 20s, reducing the number of teams in the league, now to 17. In 1980, the NHL's first attempt at putting a team in Atlanta finally came to an end, and the Flames were forced to move, going to Calgary, where they remained named the Flames, still named after a fire that happened in a city now on the opposite corner of the continent. Or at least pretty close to it anyway, outside of Alaska. And finally, in 1982, before things settled down, at least for a little bit, after 6 years in Colorado, the Rockies were forced to move again, this time going to New Jersey and becoming the Devils, where they still are today. Of course, while all this was happening within the NHL, after years of negotiating, the NHL and WHA did finally agree on a merger in 1979, with 4 of the WHA teams joining the NHL. The New England Whalers, who did have to change their name to the Hartford Whalers because the Bruins complained. The Bruins did also complain about the Penguins stealing their colors, as if they owned black and yellow somehow, even with both the Steelers and Pirates having had it for quite a while. Maybe that was just a Bruins thing to do back then, was to complain. Good thing that's no longer a problem. Anyway, outside of the Hartford Whalers, who also still have one of the best logos in the history of professional sports, there were also the Quebec Nordiques, the Winnipeg Jets, different from the current Winnipeg Jets, but we'll get to that, and the Edmonton Oilers. And with these 4 teams from the WHA, also came the return of Bobby Hull with the Winnipeg Jets, as well as old Red Wings star and greatest player in NHL history to this point, Gordie Howe, for one last season in the NHL. But probably most importantly, what the NHL-WHA merger also brought was a 19-year-old kid whose name even most non-hockey fans now know.